Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. My name is Diego Román.
Hi, I'm Katie Kirchgasler.
In this part of the seminar, we will share a little bit about our research and how we come to this work. So in my research, I examined the linguistic, cultural, and environmental practices of linguistically minoritized students and how these practices are perceived by their bilingual and science teachers in the places that these students inhabit, they go to school or where they live. I conduct my research in English and Spanish and in both to honor the linguistic practices of multilingual communities. And my research tries to answer the following question. How do linguistically minoritized communities perceive, content, and respond to the opportunities and challenges they encounter in the places that they inhabit?
My research investigates power relations that are taking place within science education. And my current project is looking at how science education has conceptualized linguistic difference and how that divides and orders students into populations who are then diagnosed as needing different kinds of science instruction and matched with different pedagogies. And so theoretically and methodologically, I draw on Foucauldian, post-foundationalist and post-structuralist science and technology studies approaches to try to think about how difference is produced and regulated, not assuming categories of difference like race and language as objective or kind of timeless structures, but trying to think about how those distinctions are continually being produced and reconfigured. It's an attempt to invert the paradigm of how can we better support X category of students in moving from the margins of science education to the center, to instead asking, based on Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, kind of how has science education elevated some as a normative center by making up others as needing rescue to qualify as an articulate student, a healthy citizen, or a future scientist. And I see all of those descriptors as historically contingent, but also acting in the world to shape people's perceptions of students that have material consequences in their lives.
And we came to this work together, as Katie was describing, because racial linguistic ideologies also question the perceptual apparatus, like who is seen as performing the particular linguistic norms, which are mostly the middle upper class white communities, into how we can for example, when we do language instruction for quote unquote English learners or emerging bilinguals, is how can we support these students in acquiring these linguistic practices? What are the linguistic practices of linguistically minoritized students? And how can we support those students in acquire quote unquote the standard practices of the scientific community? So using Flores and Rosa, racial linguistic ideologies, we kind of question, right? When using or following Katie's methodology of historicizing methodology, is how have these practices become normalized and naturalized as the way we should talk about science or what science is the one to be learned, rather than seeing these practices as ideologies, the social historical ideologies that have determined what is the what is the naturalized, what is the essentialized, but removing this essentialization process, right? So right now we have the practice, and so far research has been, most research I would say has been devoted on how can we have, let's say for example, linguistically minoritized students to acquire those practices, rather than questioning the practices that need to be acquired and how those practices came to be as the norm in science education and scientific communities. So our work in our conversations with Katie since we met have been about how can we extend research that is being done in science education to not question the language producer subject, like the speaking subject, as Flores and Rosa called it, but also questioning the listening subject and the context in which this listening and language practices in the science context takes place. So the perceptual apparatus in which linguistically minoritized students enact their linguistic practices. So this was kind of a little introduction to how we came to this work together. And you're going to see how we arrived from different epistemological orientations and theoretical understandings of working with, for example, in my case, primarily in the field of bilingual education and science education around environmental issues, and Katie's in her work from a Foucauldian perspective and a historicizing approach. So, and as I say, as you are going to hear in our conversation, we are coming at this from different perspectives, but we are interested in the perceptual apparatus, how even when the students acquire, quote unquote, these linguistic practices or knowledge, they are still perceived as deviant from the norm because the norm has been established with particular agendas behind. And our work also tries to highlight that without consideration or discussions around these processes that created what it is that needs to be acquired, or the practices that are associated with these norms, then we are again questioning the subject rather than the system. So, which has been, I think, for much research has focused on that piece, like on the language producer than on the language listener or the perceptual apparatus as Katie described.
So in our time together today, we want to really think about a few themes. So how do raciolinguistic perspectives on the one hand and historicizing perspectives on the other help us rethink these hierarchies of race and language as entangled, not separate, and as historically contingent? We want to think about how language and science get what Guadalupe Valdez calls curricularized, or thinking about it as productive of kinds of people. We want to think about, as Diego said, turning scrutiny from the speaker to the listener and the perceptual apparatus, and then also to explore limits of some of the taken for granted ways of thinking about equity and diversity, including asset-based approaches, to think about what are the limits there and what new questions need to be asked to understand how science education is really implicated in what Rosa and Flores have called these hierarchies of racial and linguistic legitimacy that tie back to colonial histories, kind of coloniality, modernity, distinctions, processes of making modern subjects. And we can ask then how science education becomes a site where these hierarchies keep getting reconfigured on these divides of expert versus lay, rationality versus superstition, intellectual sophistication versus the infantilized or naive, the agentic self versus the not yet empowered others. So we really want to think about what is our role and responsibility as science ed researchers in understanding how these hierarchies have gotten entangled, how they play out in the really mundane details of doing a research project or supervising a student teacher or teaching science in any kind of setting. So we're excited to dialogue together about this right now, and then to hear your thoughts when we get together.
So we are going to start defining each of our research spaces, right? I think we have defined how we come to this intersection together from different approaches and different epistemologies around what it means to do science education research or language in understanding the constructs around language in science instruction. So in my work, as you can see in this slide, I have tried to identify in this slide these different constructs in the context of racial linguistic ideologies, using the language of the language producing subject, and on the other hand, the perceptual apparatus. So I taught science for middle school science for 7 years, first in Wisconsin, then in California, to multilingual students. And I became interested in the role that language plays in science instruction. And my research was, during my dissertation work, was devoted in trying to understand what do we mean by the language of science and what are the linguistic features of what we used to call in those days in 2014, the language of science. That terminology has changed over the years. Then we used to call the language of school science. Then there is recent work about the language of ideas. And what do we mean by that? When researchers or teachers say science texts are difficult to understand. So my work was trying to explore what is in this text that is difficult or creates difficulties, particularly for language learners. So that is what you see on the left-hand side of your screen in the triangle, and the sides are also purposeful, because that, to me, I still do work in that area, trying to determine what is complicated for an English learner or for someone who is acquiring English as an additional language to understand in a piece of written text or in an oral presentation. And how can we explain scientific concepts in a way that is accessible to different communities? So, but that to be just one piece. So part of my research, of my work, has been about determining whether and how this text work to create or communicate scientific meaning. The second piece that I see more and more has been about this critical language awareness. That is also about the language producing subject. So we're still focusing on what the students can do when they read a text. How can we support them in better accessing this information by either clarifying or simplifying different features of the text? Recently, has been more work done around we should be aware that there is not just one way of using language in science to accomplish a particular thing. So being aware that, yes, there is this standard variety of language that is used to produce or to communicate science. But number one, that is just one way. And number two, that it might not even be the best way to do so. So that there are power dynamics that are embedded into determining the standard variety of the language, who gets to speak it, and how that variety is spoken by the more powerful groups in a particular region. So there is some research right now that if you read, for example, Luis Posa, Enrique Suarez, about using translanguaging and valuing the different ways that the students communicate meaning about a scientific concept or a science concept. And also as teachers valuing the different ways students communicate meaning in multilingual classrooms to accomplish different functions as they learn and teach scientific concepts, right? So now there is this awareness that there are more than one way to communicate science, and that we should be valuing these different ways of languages or languaging as we enact our linguistic practice in the science class. So, and I have done some work in that area as well. Then, however, these two only gets us to the language producing subject, right? It's how are our teachers aware that there is more than one way that the students enact these linguistic practices, emphasizing that the students, their home varieties, the language varieties are okay to produce or to communicate scientific knowledge. And the little triangle, it's so these are the standard forms in which science knowledge is communicated, and the way these science texts are written, the way reports are written, these different genres, registers. But the more, and in my conversation with Katie, we have been thinking that doesn't get us to the big picture, the big triangle on the right, which is the perceptual apparatus. And that's where racial linguistics is particularly, these racial linguistic ideologies or perspectives is particularly powerful, because then we move the lens from the language producing subject. So you can imagine the linguistically minoritized student, and how can the student be supported in acquiring either the linguistic practices or being aware that the practices are valid and correct, Two, we move the lens to the big picture, to these contexts, the social historical context in which these practices, these linguistic practices are enacted. So, and the racial linguistic lens, what Flores and Rosa describe, is that not even when the linguistically minoritized student uses these practices, that the student is perceived as an authentic or member of the community. So of the science community, for example, there is still this perception that not even when there is not a difference in the type of language that is used, the subject or the student is still racialized, and their practices, the linguistic practices, are seen as not the norm of the community. So essentially, racial linguistic lens allow us to move the lens to question the system, like or the languages, the practices that need to be acquired, because not even by acquiring those practices, the students are perceived as members of the scientific, or for example, a scientific community.
So where I came to this work, I also started out teaching multilingual students science, first in Spain and then in Massachusetts. I came to graduate school trying to figure out, okay, if closing the achievement gap is not equity, what is? And through studying kind of post-colonial science studies and trying to think historically about how where science education came from, how it started dividing students, it really forced me to rethink what the project of teaching science has been about as part of an institutional practice and a governing practice, really. So my dissertation study that launched this line of thinking was that I started out looking at a high school in Wisconsin where the high school was under investigation from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights because of the racial and socioeconomic and linguistic disparities in who was placed in the upper track science courses and the lower track being often threatening that student's ability to apply to a four-year college because those classes didn't even count as science classes. And so trying to understand those tracking disparities was some of the beginning of wondering, like, how does this keep happening? How does it work at the really mundane nitty-gritty level? How do those distinctions keep being reproduced? How do those hierarchies keep being naturalized? And so one of the things I noticed was that the teachers who saw a need for the lower track courses to still be there and not just get rid of them, there was a notion that the students classified as English learners, but also as recent immigrants, were described as having immediate needs, that their science courses, for instance, the ESL science classes, would be oriented towards health, safety, nutrition, thinking about how to apply science to their everyday lives. Whereas the students who were placed in the upper track courses were described as having future needs, not immediate needs. And so you see this temporal distinction here of who's seen as having immediate needs versus future needs. Then you could read that as simply racially coded language. But then what really struck me was that the same year I was observing in this high school, the Next Generation Science Standards came out. And the Appendix D is these case studies. And you can see that on the slide here that they have case studies for how to make the NGSS or the standards accessible to all students, specifically the economically disadvantaged, quote, race and ethnicity, treated as a subgroup rather than a sociopolitical dividing practice, students with disabilities, English language learners, girls, alternative education, and finally, gifted and talented students. And what was really striking to me was that looking at the pedagogies prescribed in kind of recommended as equitable for each of these groups, there was a lot of similarities across case studies 1 through 6, as all students having immediate needs for their science instruction to be made more relevant to kind of issues of health. The example was using a discussion about the unhealthiness of corn syrup as a motivating strategy for students from non-dominant racial and ethnic groups, in quotes. And I started looking historically to understand, is this new? Is this kind of distinction making new? And what you can see in this next slide is that if you trace back in just one science education journal, Science Ed, back to when it started in 1916, and it was called General Science Quarterly, you can see that difference has actually been a focal point of science ed research since the beginning of this field. So the idea that we need to all of the sudden make diversity visible is to suggest that we have not been making difference visible. There hasn't been actually a preoccupation with these perceived differences the entire century that we've been doing this as a field. And so what you can see in the right column is these are some of the case study terms: gifted and talented, students with disabilities, non-dominant racial and ethnic groups, English language learners. And I'm not suggesting that these are synonyms or equivalent, but there are similar kinds of distinctions being made at every decade going back to the 1920s. And you see similar kinds of pedagogies being recommended for each. And again, the gifted and talented pedagogies tend to be quite distinct from the pedagogies that are recommended for students with disabilities or marked by these factors of race, ethnicity, or language. All of those students end up being prescribed somewhat similar pedagogies that are more oriented towards making healthy decisions and preparing them as citizens, with the assumption that some may go on to be scientists, but that the focus on healthy citizenship is really kind of a persistent concern and anxiety. And I had previously paid attention more to the race and ethnicity category and how that was being differently constructed over time. And it was in conversation with Diego that we started thinking about how language and race as objects of study have really played out in these very pernicious and varying ways.
We have been thinking about the role that all of these systems, and in my case, I look at language ideologies, play into this enacting or identifying a particular language variety as the standard, right? In similar ways as, or parallel ways, I would say, rather than similar, to what Katie identifies as what is the science that needs to be taught. I try to think about who and how specific language varieties get to be defined as the normative variety of the particular community, and how different populations get to be seen either as matching or using that language variety or as not matching that language variety. So that gets us to these different ideas about language, right? Like, what is language? Who speaks a particular language? Who gets to define what that particular language is, and the purposes or functions of a particular language variety in a particular community, such as science education. So let's start with, because I know that most of you might be coming from the science ed community rather than from a linguistics perspective. So in this slide, you can see a definition of racial linguistic ideologies in the context of the ideology, right? So racial linguistic ideologies is the study of language and race together to challenge these hierarchies of racial and linguistic hierarchies, and to dismantle these hierarchical systems, and to look at the experiences of the minoritized community, and to challenge these essentialistic notions of language and race, ethnicity, and culture. So to that, we can see how, for example, certain varieties of language index or are indexed by the listening subject, or using like the term from Rosa Flores, through the white gaze as deficient, and a gap from what is considered the norm. And how these conceptions create these hierarchies in terms of who speaks the right variety of the language, and put some languages or varieties as superior and others as inferior. So racial linguistic ideologies allow us to see and to understand that the focus shouldn't be of the linguistically minoritized student acquiring or performing what had been essentially white middle upper class norms, like linguistic practices, but we want to focus on how to explore, honor, and extend the linguistic practices that these communities, these students are already using to accomplish specific things, rather than seeing those as deviant from the norm, and how those should be challenged and questioned as well. So there is a paper that and all of these papers we're going to post at the end of our presentation. We are going to have access to them. A recent paper by Catherine Lemmy, who works with Brian Brown, Quentin's, and Lynn Sumo and Andrew Weil, in which they identify 3 language ideologies that play a particular role in the context of science education. One of them is these ideologies of language purism, that there are, for example, that the Spanish or English are considered to be right or pure, that there is a variety of English, there is a right variety of Spanish, that those are essentially the standard, that there is the standard variety of the language. And the purism has also been identified through this monoglossic lens, rather than from a multilingual lens in which multilinguality is the norm. But in the United States, what has been so far guiding linguistic education or education for language learners is that there is the right variety of English. That variety is the result of a community that mostly speaks English in a particular variety of that English. So a monoglossic, looking at language from a monolingual lens. Also, that variety becomes the norm in which these subjects like science are taught, and that the individual who uses that is the native speaker. So it's also questioning who is the native speaker. But also all of these 3, like the native speaker, the standard language, and this linguistic purism have played a role into determining these gaps of who is where students are to where students need to be in terms of language usage in the context of science learning. So if you add to that this intersectionality of race, right, that when even these students use those varieties, racialized students are still perceived as not using those varieties because of how they look, because how they are perceived by this white gaze, by this white listening subject and apparatus. Just to summarize, is that the study of language is never just about language, right? So language ideologies essentially put language in the broader social context in which language use takes place. So by connecting these concepts, this language usage, to how language users are perceived and whether they are perceived as using the right variety in the right context. But again, that puts rather than putting or emphasizing the practices of the speaker, what we're trying to do in our work is to say, what about how they are perceived? Can we question or critique the perceptual apparatus or the science or the ideologies behind the science that needs to be taught and the ideologies behind the linguistic practices that are attached to the ways of doing science?
I'll just pick up there and kind of give you a sense of how, from drawing on historicizing methodologies, I'm also trying to think about this apparatus, but in a slightly different way. So one of the key shifts in a Foucauldian approach is to what's called decenter the subject. So rather than start from the assumption of different categories of who those subjects are, and ask how they've been perceived and how they act, how they've been treated, how they treat others, the shift is away from that who, like the biased who, the marginalized who, to really go one step before that question the question before the question, which is to say, how did they even get seen as a separate and defined who in the first place, and differently positioned? So it's to basically shift from thinking about the subjects who are both perceived and perceiving to the perceptual apparatus that kind of governs both self and other, that shapes how I, as a science teacher, was trained to see my students, how I see myself and my own language practices. And so some of the different terms that, or kind of analytics that you could think of for this would be Sylvia Wynter's work. She talks about the rules that govern perception in what Foucault calls like a grid of intelligibility, which is the idea that there's many, many different practices that are all shaping, kind of intersecting and shaping what seems possible or reasonable at a given time and place. So what it seems to be necessary to do as a science teacher, what it seems necessary to do as a science ed researcher is very historically specific and shaped by all sorts of different practices, different imperatives and ethical political principles. These are all kind of coming together in a grid. And another way to think about that is with a colleague, Aisha Yoku, we've been looking at ordering pedagogy. So like how the pedagogy itself in saying who needs what and to what ends actually kind of divides students and puts them in order of like, what do they need based on what category? And specifically, I've thought about how science teachers have been trained through this perceptual apparatus, and science ed researchers as well, to think of some students as potential scientists and others as not yet healthy citizens. And how that divide is a really pervasive hierarchy in US science education, but also more broadly. Well, what you can see is that language itself was not always taken for granted as a category. It didn't always mean the same thing. So when does it become an issue in science ed research? How does it get taken up and used to see difference? And then specifically, how have US science educators been trained to think about language as requiring a pedagogical differentiation in some way, and to what effect? And so methodologically, what it means for me when I think about a perceptual apparatus is I'm trying to understand the how. So rather than the who of power of who is treated differently, how those distinctions get seen. And I do several different ways of trying to do this kind of genealogical approach, it's called, or a history of the present. So one, you can see on the slide here, I'm trying to think about a literature review differently, to think about if I pulled through the idea of Spanish speaking as a category, if I look through the entire last century of science ed research in these three journals, what would that show me if I pull up that ICE core about the different ways that Spanish in the United States has continually been taken up, but never quite in the same way. You can see here, back in the 1920s, there was this term, the Latin races, as needing a particular kind of science instruction in Chicago. Later, students who had a native tongue of Spanish were prescribed a different form. By the 50s and 60s, these were called unacculturated Spanish Americans. And by the 1990s, there was talk of a Hispanic American culture, but similar kind of distinctions being ascribed to each. And so trying to tease out what really has changed in the past century and what has stayed the same is one thing we can do when we're trying to attend to how the same category gets positioned as a language, as an ethnicity, as a race, as a culture, and where they're plotted along spectrum of what they need. And so you can see in this next slide, psychological is the top row, sociological is the middle row, and anthropological is the bottom row. These are all specific social scientific distinctions about the mind, the home, and the outlook or culture that are not natural ways of thinking about people. These are specific practices that I'm thinking about as coming together in that grid to make up the kind of person, whether described in the 20s and 40s as a foreign tongue, the unacculturated in the mid-century, and the linguistically diverse, that similar distinctions through similar kinds of perceptual apparatuses at these different time points keep creating hierarchies of what they need. And you can see, just as one example, concrete operational. By the 1970s, it had become reasonable to use a Piagetian task like this little balance here. And that if they could figure out how to do the Piagetian task and understand the conservation of mass, then that would be a sign that that student had progressed past the concrete operational stage. So if they couldn't figure out this task, that they were stuck in the concrete operational stage. So they looked at a study of, quote, Black and Spanish American urban students. And they found that because only 13 to 15% of these subjects demonstrated evidence through tasks like this, that for the majority of persons in this segment of society, formal operational skills will probably never develop under existing conditions. Therefore, it is imperative to involve concrete materials. And so what you see here is then what follows in this article is a justification for tracking, that saying we need to have lower track science courses in the name of, they didn't call it equity yet, but in the name of accessibility, that we need to provide this different kind of science education to meet their needs as concrete operational thinkers. And so that's just one example that cuts across language and race categories, but is really not about, arguably not about simply derived from those things. It's not simply about linguistic racism as a thing outside of science ed, but a very deeply embedded set of practices within science ed that produces distinctions in the name of kinds of people by language, by race, by ethnicity, all very entangled over time. And that these things, kind of how we think about the mind and scientific thinking and scientific reasoning as abstract, all of that also has to be implicated in how students are being produced as different, which is not at all to elevate the abstract reasoning of AP physics, for instance, as actually superior or neutral or objective, but to recognize that all of these are cultural and socio-historical practices, some of which have been given prestige and others that have been devalued. And I think science education research in the past few decades, thinking through the non-neutrality of science writ large, especially the natural or physical sciences. However, there tends to be an assumption after Tom Popkowitz has called the alchemy of school science. So there tends to be a conflation of, we assume that research science or the natural sciences is somehow kind of simplified or derived into what's taught in school. And so when we critique the coloniality of science, for example, we're critiquing the coloniality of the natural sciences and then saying, you know, now we have to decolonize science education. One of the kind of key shifts in thinking about the alchemy is that it wasn't just the natural sciences that helped shape what got taught in schools as science. So if we look historically, it was really the social sciences and also the linguistic sciences. And so that's been part of, in conversation with Diego, trying to think about all of the assumptions built in about treating science now as a language in the past few decades, talking science, science discourse. What kind of assumptions are we bringing in from the linguistic sciences now about kinds of people, naturalized hierarchies, target forms of language that we hope that all students acquire? There's a lot of assumptions built in there when we're borrowing from linguistics, just like when we borrowed a lot from psychology or sociology as a field, that we're carrying in these historical assumptions about that have been linked up with kind of biopolitical projects of kind of regulating populations, trying to create better public health and more harmonious societies. There's assumptions built in about how science education can make society better by ensuring that all students become informed, but also adopt evidence-based argumentation and things that are now taken as like a linguistic marker of them becoming more scientist-like, more rational, more agentic. And there's kind of always in that both an idea of who's already agentic or well-spoken or articulate is something that raciolinguistic scholars have really unpacked, kind of the racializing history of these distinctions. And so that's something that in a conversation we want to always keep in mind, that not only is the non-neutrality of science with a capital S, but also of the educational sciences, the linguistic sciences, the social sciences that have all come in and shaped what we count in the science curriculum as what must be learned, the standards, but also how we assess.
Like Guadalupe Valdez, she has a 2015 piece in which she questions kind of this, or in many ways she says, what Katie mentioned, these assumptions that are made when we curricularize a particular subject, or in this case, language. So for instance, when we curricularize language, we sequence it. We define what needs to be acquired and with what purpose, how it will be evaluated, and how it can be taught to different particular groups. So versus language, in more like this language in perception, is a communicative quality or a skill that human beings have to communicate with each other, to talk with each other, and that is acquired mostly in a social setting, like by using it, by enacting your practices with a purpose, with a social purpose that you care about. Like you use language to accomplish something, and that something needs to be something that you care about, communicating, learning, and discussing, right? Versus the way languages have been treated usually, it's about learning particular linguistic features like grammar, lexical vocabulary, a particular even accent, in most of the time in a very much artificial settings, such as the school classroom, that move away from the social feature in which language is usually acquired or is naturally acquired. So on the one hand, we have this curricularizing language, and when you combine or entangle language with science concepts, or then you have these two features that are happening at the same time, like the knowledge of science that needs to be acquired with the acquisition of this language in this particular context of, let's say, the science classroom. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, most of the research has been about how to support a particular group of students, for example, English learners or emerging bilinguals, to acquire this language in the context of the science classroom or science instruction, right? But as Katie mentioned, that brings a lot of assumptions about what language is and how language is acquired and the purpose of acquiring that language. Also assumptions about what is the knowledge to be acquired and how those knowledges are taught and sequenced and curricularized, and also assumptions about the linguistic community to which language and science are taught. So all of this gets conflated, and part of the racial linguistics lens is to how these students, rather than on the student, is on the how these students are perceived, even when they are acquiring this knowledge and language, but they are still perceived as not belonging to this quote unquote scientific community. So in my research, I have been looking at identity, at the concept of identity. What does it take for a particular person to be recognized as the kind of person that belongs to a particular context? Using G's 2000 definition of identity as being recognized as the kind of person in a given context, like that you're recognized as a member of the scientific community and as using the language required to be part of that community in a way. But again, that when we put that into the broader context of racial and social inequalities in which we live, we are faced with these these ideas of the native speaker, right? Like it's not even about the speaking English, it's about the speaking a particular type of English in a particular way to be recognized as a member of a particular community. But that happens also in this context of linguistic racism. And again, the work on Flores and Rosa in 2016, and more recently, Anne Charity Hoadley did a piece about the role of linguistics in in many ways attacking or demystifying or these hierarchies that exist about languages and language diversity, and how issues of race, ethnicity, and language take place in educational settings that harm linguistically minoritized communities. So in my other work, in work in regards to the linguistic practices of minoritized communities, I did one study with science teachers working with Spanish speakers, and the science classes were taught in Spanish. But teachers were most interested in that, were, if not all, they were interested or paying a lot of attention into the type of language that was used to communicate scientific concepts. So they were interested on the form rather than on the substance of the message. And we noticed that these, as we mentioned before, this linguistic purism, these ideas that the standard variety is the best variety to communicate, to use to communicate knowledge, stifled the expression of these multilingual identities and denied students their linguistic capital, and determined who these students or were perceived as who they could or could not be. That goes back to these classifications and how language has been used to classify the students, but mostly focusing on what they lack rather than what they do. And that what they do is already accomplishing all of these wonderful activities and practices, but they are still perceived not as fulfilling what we consider as science or what we consider as the appropriate language that should be used in a scientific context.
And that actually ties in. So a different study that I'm conducting with Cynthia Baeza, we're looking at the history actually of Mexican American experience of being placed in segregated schools in the United States, which was happening from the 1910s to the 1940s. And we're trying to understand, historians are very clear on how those segregated schools were often teaching vocational subjects, similar to the Jim Crow school segregation in the US South. What hasn't been looked at before is how whether science was taught at all and how it was taught. And so we're trying to understand, how does that kind of forgotten history help us understand, was there any carryover from what was happening in these segregated schools to what's happening in kind of what was considered the mainstream US science education. A lot of science ed scholars who are writing in science ed journals, who are also who are directly supervising teachers in segregated Mexican schools in California, for instance, and presenting at science ed conferences, there's a lot of crosstalk there. There was also a lot of crosstalk between segregated schools in the US South and Southwest and colonial schools, so in the US occupied Philippines, which I've studied previously. And there was a lot of sharing of practices, because at this time, there was a notion of curricular adaptation, of how to adapt the curriculum to the child in order to help them adapt to society, to be part of what they called at the time the social organism. So you have biological, evolutionary notions of adaptation that are mixed in with eugenic notions of race betterment, through intervening in people's home lives and their home environments as part of a practice of what was called Americanizing, which meant both trying to racialize them to be more white and to Americanize them culturally in a process of assimilation. And that was very kind of entangled at the time with neo-Lamarckian ideas of race. And so one of the things that we've studied is how there's kind of comparing and contrasting how the NGSS, the science standards and kind of literature reviews of from the 1990s, for instance, of meeting the needs of Hispanic American students, how do those recommended practices compare to those in the segregated schools? And to the point about what languages and language varieties that Diego was talking about, one of the things we found was really interesting was that there was a notion of language as race at the time, and that notion was that the language you spoke, your mother tongue, carried in it an evolutionary capital for thought, and a storehouse of accumulated knowledge of all the people who used to speak that language, which sounds extremely strange today. But this was something that was even cited in John Dewey's really popular How We Think book, that he described the working capital of thought that was built up for us by our mother tongue. And so there's a very deeply embedded assumption that cultivated English or scientific English could feed the mind from the British legacy of having recovered so-called like Greco-Roman, this kind of whitewashing of the prior scientific discoveries as then being coming through British English. And so those who were seen as speaking Mexican Spanish and Appalachian English, for instance, so this was all sorts of spectrums of non or not yet white at the time, they were all described as speaking a language that was obsolete or backwards in time, and that the language itself lacked scientific or medical knowledge. And you can see as late as the 1990s, science education research is using this notion of non-intellectualized languages. For instance, in the Philippines, there's the studies there in the 1990s saying that these languages simply do not have the capacity to convey the abstract thought that we ascribe to science with a capital S. And so I think that's a really striking example of what Jonathan Rosa talks about, of like looking like a language, sounding like a race, that to be heard as speaking Appalachian English or Mexican Spanish is then perceived as saying something about that person's mind and its capacity for scientific reasoning.
I think that is the indexicality, like in linguistics, when you index values or create value judgments about a person that don't have anything to do about the language that the person uses. That, for example, when you're listening to me, that the ideas about who is a Latinx person are created through the biases we hold as we hear this person speaking, right? And so, for example, there are Latinx, and I wasn't born in the US, I was born in Ecuador. But there are US-born Latinx people who do not have, quote unquote, an accent whatsoever when they speak, quote unquote, standard American English, but they are still perceived or seen or conceptualized or imagined as having particular characteristics, right? That in what Katie was saying in terms of how they learn, what so it's nothing to do, and they are judged by their language practices in these things that don't have anything to do with the language that they use. So it's this indexicalization of language signifying these social, cultural, cognitive dimensions, right? Or particularly of linguistically minoritized communities. And the work of Román Martínez, he did a paper with his colleagues in 2015, in which he identified this richness of all of the practices that multilinguals actually do, but that those practices are perceived through a deficit-based perspective as essentially not doing what is needed to be done, because they are not even understood as doing academic or schoolwork, right? So for example, and that also connects to the work of Ofelia Garcia and translanguaging, that if I were to translanguage and use Spanish right now, and say a couple of words in Spanish around the scientific or this type of academic presentation, then suddenly that is seen as it's because I couldn't say them in English, rather than because I was trying to emphasize a point that my Spanish word would make it clear. But it's always this perception, or what is guiding sometimes is this perception of not being able to do, rather than the subject with their own agency, using their linguistic repertoire to do things that that subject perceives as the other language, not having the capacity to communicate a particular meaning, like using the pragmatic discourse in linguistics. So, but Ramon Martinez, what he says is that beyond not recognizing this richness that is the result of the linguistic repertoires of multilingual communities, the other thing is that we also need to recognize that we all have conflicting language ideologies, right? And with Katie, we have talked about this. Like, we also recognize that, for example, writing or in academic journals requires using a particular and mastering a particular register and genre of how academic writing works. So we can, on the one hand, say we shouldn't essentialize these practices. On the other hand, we are using them, we're enacting them. So our articulated language ideologies questions the essentialization of these practices, while at the same time we are enacting them in our academic writing and in the way we also present in academic conferences. So what Ramon Martinez says, one of the interesting things about using a language ideologies lens is that these language ideologies are multiple, we can have a variety of language ideologies, or some of them which are articulated, like this is what we say we do, versus embodied, what we are actually doing, and they are in tension sometimes with each other. They are in conflict with each other. So in many ways, what in my work, what I try to do is to say, as I was describing at the beginning, so these are what is perceived as how these students are perceived, with a question in the system, also acknowledging some of the essentialization of these practices, but questioning how those practices came to be. And I think that is what I absolutely value the work that Katie brings, because historicizing and putting these practices and this knowledge into the context of how these practices came to be essentialized, how these communities came to be described as not meeting the norm, the linguistic or scientific knowledge standards, and how, rather than how do we support them, how do we also question these taken for granted understandings of what it counts as to be part of the scientific community, or counts as speaking and writing or communicating properly in the science classroom. We should also be, questioning this area rather than only the type of supports that we can develop to help the students acquire these practices.
Right, and you're actually reminding me of Catherine Mazek and Claudia Herbas-Donoso's work. So they have several pieces thinking about the specific history of English medium instruction in Puerto Rico, and thinking about the kind of coloniality and explicit Americanization attempts through English medium instruction, and thinking about how university students today who are being asked to write and publish, as you were saying, scientific papers in English, how they're translanguaging and how they're using their full repertoires and critiquing the limits of English in the conversation that they're having. And it also reminds me of the work of, as you mentioned, Luis Posa, who's drawing on Nelson Flores's idea of dynamically lingual education. So thinking about how do you teach science in a way that, one, is rejecting linguistic othering, two, is rejecting these static idealized notions of languages as discrete, three, to provide spaces for students to experiment with their fluid language practices, four, to make language into a contested part of the curriculum, to have these, as you're saying, like metalinguistic conversations about where these language practices came from, why did you choose to use this prestige variety versus this variety? Like what are the power dynamics there? What do you notice about how scientists are speaking in their videos about their research? How do we want to speak? And kind of thinking about all of the paradoxes and the tensions with students in that space. Beth Warren and colleagues just had a chapter on onto epistemic hierarchies and violence. And they start actually with a quote from Toni Morrison, that canon building So we can think about the canon of scientific language, the canon of science and standards is empire building, and not just figuratively, like literally in Puerto Rico and the Philippines and in settler colonialism in the United States, that science education was part of that history, explicitly recognized as a laboratory of hygienic modern citizens, of race betterment, these eugenic imperatives. And it wasn't just in the name of segregation and exclusion, but actually in the name of what was called in the Philippines benevolent assimilation. And so to me, understanding how canon building is empire building demands that we also recognize that even in our most progressive and kind of well-intentioned inclusionary efforts, there can be these kind of latent historical imperatives, like the humanitarian imperative to help students overcome health disparities by teaching them to apply scientific language to their own health choices, things like that. So it's not to say that any particular practice is necessarily good or bad, but all could be dangerous in terms of if we don't recognize the effects of power that kind of got sedimented into all of these dividing and ordering practices that are just taken as, let's help these kids develop, let's help them be successful in the future. And so Beth Warren and colleagues end with this question: what is required of us as researchers and educators to disentangle received disciplinary knowledge and ways of knowing from what Morrison names as the apparatus of control, and to enable expansive and insurgent ways of learning, being, and acting in, with, and across disciplines? And so that's what we really hope for the seminar. We really are excited to hear about the research projects that you're all already engaged with, what your past personal, professional, educational experiences that touch on any of the questions that we've raised today.
And just to also conclude, I think for me, it's also like Guadalupe Valdez and Danny Morales Doyle had mentioned. I see all of these research questions and line of inquiry as not excluding the academic development and the skills linguistically minoritized children need in order to succeed in academic settings. So Guadalupe Valdez, in her 2015 piece, she mentioned that she's concerned about how to leverage and develop and strengthen the linguistic repertoires of linguistically minoritized communities, especially in her paper, in the paper that she wrote, of Latinx communities, while at the same time preparing them to succeed in mainstream education. And so the challenge is, how can we address educational access and equity while respecting this multilingualism and critiquing this essentialization of practices and languages in this context? So it's not an easy task, and believe me, Katie and I have had conversations about this all the time, on how to work in this imperfect and unequal and racist system with linguistically minoritized communities that are perceived as not meeting the standards, but are in many ways only addressed as, how can we support you in meeting those standards, without questioning what the standard in their language or knowledge variety is. So, and what Morales Doyle mentioned in his, I think it's his 2015 paper as well, is this idea that they are not exclusionary, that having a critical perspective or addressing this historical or how this practice came to be does not mean that we are not deeply caring about the academic achievement of these children and providing them with the tools that they need to succeed academically in these systems, right? But as Katie mentioned, addressing both, right? Addressing these intersections in this through what has been described and we have been describing as this white gaze, right? As this, and who is saying either you acquired them or you didn't acquire a particular standard, shouldn't be also seen as, so questioning the standard shouldn't be, it's not excluding that there are skills and knowledge that need to be acquired, especially for students that are judged through these racist and unequal lenses. So I think, like what Katie was saying, we encourage you, and I think we presented in this during this conversation different ways of addressing these questions and how our research intersects, and the type of questions that we're asking in different ways through linguistic explorations of the richness of multilingual communities, or through historicizing and Foucauldian approaches to what it means to be, the thing to be acquired, right? And not distinguishing between the subjective and subjective. And for me, using the linguistic repertoires to acquire or to have this, like what Katie mentioned, these meta-linguistic conversations about the language that needs to be acquired, but without diminishing the value of your own linguistic practices.
Mm-hmm.
So
sort of historicizing is not to debunk or subtract reality from science ed research, but really to add reality back in, to restore the tethers that have been cleaved that make all of these standards appear out of a vacuum as simply neutral. In conversation with Diego, I've been thinking about is that in trying to restore those tethers, that is one of many tactics that we could use to try to unsettle those racial-linguistic distinctions of who needs what type of science ed for what purpose, to denaturalize what's been produced and policed as the normal self, which again, doesn't just impact linguistically minoritized communities. That's also a governing practice, a biopolitical technique that shapes who I, as a person who was taught to see myself as white and monolingual, to think about kind of how that acted on me and my own self-perception and my perception of others, that these techniques are not just unidirectionally directed or applied, and certainly not totalizing. And then how does that then help us to reorient to stories other than those that we've been told about in the research literature that I've been looking at, like how those classified as different have been presented there. And then how does that really open up space for the rich repertoires, as you're saying, Diego, and kind of what Warren et al. Are talking about is the ontoepistemic multiplicity that has been foreclosed and precluded from even consideration because it's been always positioned as distant from a standard that hasn't been questioned broadly. So that's what we're hoping to open up, and we're really excited to talk.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Diego.